Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming here today to LeMay America's Car Museum. My name is Kelsey Cross. I am the education manager here, and we're so excited you're here. Thank you for joining us on this hot day, and I am so sorry about all of the traffic outside. I know it's a mess out there, but we're happy that you made it in here. We very much appreciate it. Before I get started and I turn over to Michael, because I know that's why you're all here, I do just have a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go over first, but I promise I will keep it short and sweet. First one is our land acknowledgement. The museum acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people. We gratefully honor and respect their stewardship of this land throughout the generations. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step towards true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experience, and histories of Indigenous people of this land. In addition to this presentation today, we also have Family Steam Day going on. That's every third Saturday of the month from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we have different activities every month. And while it is geared towards kiddos, it's for anyone who is a child at heart. Today we're making Rube Goldberg machines up on the plaza, so if you want to pop by and build a crazy contraption up there, we have all the materials you need to do that. And again, those are every third Saturday of the month. And if you want to check our museum calendar, you can go to americascarmuseum.org, go under the events tab, and then museum calendar, and it will tell you all of the upcoming events. If Cars Could Talk and Family Steam Day is generously supported by Tacoma Creates. We love them. They fund a lot of our free programs here, so we thank them a lot. And without further ado, I think I'm just going to go ahead and pass it over to Michael because I can keep talking and talking, but I do not know nearly as much as you do about Cuban cars, and I think that's why everyone is here today.
Fantastic.
So thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. What a pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Shapiro. I really appreciate your joining me today. I've written a book about old American cars. There are two editions of the book. I first published, self-published, a deluxe limited edition of the book in hardcover with a satin box and some five extra photographs that are printed in the book, as well as a signed certificate. 200 of these books were printed. I was responsible for the printing. I didn't do the printing, but I paid for it and made it happen. And I live in Argentina most of the time, and the same book was picked up in Argentina. This is an Argentine edition of the book. It's a paperback. It's the same content, the exact same content, in a less expensive presentation. The books are going to be sold here if anyone's interested. They're on sale. The hardcover edition sells for $250 some on Amazon. We're going to sell it for $160. And the paperback edition sells for $54 some plus shipping on Amazon. And we're going to sell those for $40. So I would hope maybe someone would be interested in purchasing them. So thank you. As I said, I'm Michael Shapiro, and this book came together with the help of a lot of people. I wasn't the only one to make this book happen. I won't mention them all because you don't really know them, but I will highlight and tell you what they did. The first guy is Juan. I guess I didn't say I said I wasn't going to tell you who they are, and now I'm telling you who they are. But basically, we have a photographer, my wife, an editor, a Spanish language editor, because the book is fully bilingual. The entire book from A to Z is written in both English and Spanish. And I'll talk more about that. This is my friend who helped me over 20 years that I composed the book to take images and photography from analog, slides, negatives, to digital. I started the book in 1998 and finished the book in 2019, and it was published in 2020. So yeah, about 20 years interviewing Cubans in Cuba about this phenomenon of old American cars. Why are there 30,000 or so of these pre-1960 cars still driving around Cuba? Why is it one of their main sources of transportation? How did this happen? Why is this happening? And what's interesting about it? To me, it's extremely interesting, and I'll talk about why I think so. This is the designer of the book. I like saying a couple things that sort of touched me to the heart. Why did I do this? Why did I put a book together? Well, I simply want to share emotion and what moves us. For me, that was my objective. And then also, I like this quote: the best books are the ones that come and find their writer, not the ones a writer sets out to find. And that seems to have been my situation and my reality. I went to Cuba invited by other book professionals. I'm a book professional by trade. I had a Spanish language book distribution company out of Olympia and out of San Francisco for about 20 years, called Libros Sin Fronteras, Books Without Borders. And in that work, importing and distributing books in Spanish, I was invited to go to Cuba many times by Cubans who I met at the Guadalajara Book Fair in Mexico. And finally, in 1998, I put it all together and managed to go. So I went with my Raleigh 35 millimeter, 1998, and this Walkman Sony recorder. Within 48 hours of arriving in Cuba, I had pretty much in my mind that this book, as it's printed, needed to be published. As a book professional, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. It was just a matter of doing it. And what was that? What did I want to do? I wanted to create a book with a few sort of non-negotiables. One of those non-negotiables is that Michael Shapiro isn't the story here. I'm not a big blogger. I'm not a big influencer of any kind. I'm just a guy who knows enough about books and enough about cars and speaks fluent Spanish. That put me in a position to create this book. The other sort of non-negotiable for me was that this book needs to be in color. I'll start looking at, we can start looking at some pictures, but the graphic quality of these cars, and I'll talk more about this, is fantastic and phenomenal. So this book, in my mind, had to be in color. A black and white version just wasn't going to cut mustard. And a color edition of a book is much more challenging and much more costly than a black and white edition, maybe 5 times as much. And then thirdly, the book, in my mind, had to be bilingual. I understand that a book in Spanish would work beautifully for people who speak Spanish. A book in English would work well for people who speak English. But as someone who speaks both languages, I really wanted to write a book highlighting language as well as Cuba and as well as these old vehicles. Welcome. So those were 3 non-negotiables to me, and I managed to pull it off after no more than 20 years. Cuba is a crossroads, and it's an interesting crossroads. It's almost like an abandoned crossroads. I think of it a little bit as the Western version of what in the East might have been Istanbul or Baghdad or Beijing, some of those centers where culture and society burgeoned and happened, Damascus, Athens. But Cuba's in a sort of an abandoned crossroads in that in January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and a whole bunch of young revolutionaries who were called at the time barbudos, which means bearded people. They were kind of almost like predecessors of hippies, you could say, but seriously revolutionaries. They took over the government of Batista, Fugelio Batista, who was the president of Cuba up until 1959, and created the Cuban Revolution. Cuba changed. It became, that moment was a tipping point for Cuba, a very serious tipping point, not the first, but a very poignant tipping point that brings us to the present. The Cuban Revolution has now been ongoing for 64 years. Fidel Castro is no longer alive, nor is Che Guevara, but the Cuban Revolution continues. A fourth and one of the most important non-negotiables that I had for this book is that this is not a book about politics. This is a book about history, culture, society, and cars, and language. It's not a book about politics. I have political beliefs and aspirations. We all do. Those aspirations and beliefs are not reflected in this book. Okay? This is a book that I can very comfortably present in Miami, Florida, where most of the people are not in favor of the Cuban Revolution, or in Havana, where many of the people are. Okay? So it's a non-political book about a non-political topic that was created out of politics. So there's a little bit of a irony there. These cars are in Cuba for political reasons, but I find it not that much fun and not that interesting to talk about politics. So I'm not gonna, more than just saying things that are patently true and historically accurate. So Cuba's a crossroads. There's an amazing number of artists that are in Cuba and have passed through Cuba. Historically, Cuba is fascinating. Since 1959 and before 1959, I mean, you can trace Cuban history from Columbus in 1492, when Cuba was obviously, quote unquote, discovered. There were many people on the island, so there was no discovery, but there was a finding of people and a colonization by the Spanish. That lasted until Cuban independence in the mid-1800s. Jose Marti is the father of Cuban independence, who died at battle. And then Cuba was very, and continues to be very much in the shadow, one might say, of the United States. The United States is 90 miles away. The United States is a big, potent country, and Cuba isn't. It's a smaller, a very large country for those islands, the biggest island in the Caribbean, but it's nothing compared to the United States, of course. So the 50s were a fervent and interesting moment in Cuban history. Gambling, Cuba was sort of Las Vegas before Las Vegas, as you may know. Americans loved to go to Cuba. It was freedom personified. There were obviously casinos and shows and, quite honestly, prostitution. It was an open society. You could do things you couldn't do in the United States, a little bit like Las Vegas. Baseball is a big part of Cuba. People love baseball today and forever. I love baseball, so I enjoyed going to Cuba, seeing baseball games. Celebrities are always passing through Cuba. The Pope went to Cuba. Obama went to Cuba. Writers of all sorts went to Cuba. I'm a student of Latin American literature, so I won't bore you with all the important Latin American authors that have gone to Cuba, but there are many. Conan O'Brien, many, many, many celebrities. I personally have met Che Guevara's translator. I met and saw Maradona, the great Argentine soccer player, just by being there. I was this far away from Fidel Castro in 1998, 2 meters away with a big, strong security guy in between he and I. I have a picture of it, but I don't put it in this translation because he's kind of a demon for a lot of people, and I don't want to necessarily, you know, make that my message, because it's not. You know, I Love Lucy had Desi Arnaz, Ricky Ricardo. For some of us who are about my age, you may know what I'm talking about. Cuba was a crossroads and continues to be a crossroads. For Cubans, though, life is very different. They have had a hard row to hoe. 1959 was a moment of hope and expectation, which was dashed for many people. And for others, it was a moment of expectation and hope that one might say continues. My book includes a glossary of terminology that's used in Cuban Spanish that's not used in other parts of Latin America. I won't go through a lot of these words, but some of them come from English. In Cuba, you can go to the 10 cent, which is like the dime store. There's a Woolworths store in Havana. It's no longer a Woolworths, but you can see on the sidewalk the word Woolworths. The examples are many, and I gathered many of them and put them into this glossary. This car was my father's, and now it's mine. Whoops. Has been part of the family for more than 60 years. I'm 60, and ever since I was born, this car has been in my house. A very typical statement by a Cuban, and that's what this book is. It's not me tracing Cuban history or Cuban cars, it's Cubans talking about their cars through anecdotes and testimonials. And together with the teacher, the shop owner, the driver of the Willys was a very important person. I'm talking about the Sierra Maestra. If it were not for that car, I don't know what would happen. Because you know, in Cuba, transportation is a serious problem. It started raining and the water began to flow. You could see it down there, and the driver said, "Be careful where you step, because your feet might end up outside." Another little snippet. He sealed the bottom of the car, made it waterproof, rigged it with cork, put a propeller on it, and he just drove down the road to the beach. And when he got there, they drove it into the water, took sail, and arrived to the United States. I figured that was an urban mythology until I looked it up and found this. People really did create car boats, truck boats, and managed on at least a couple, 3, 4 occasions to get them to Florida with a group of people. It's fascinating. Some of these cars are in museums in Florida. And it's probably a book in and of itself, exactly how that happened. One has a part over here and another one over there, and so on. Adaptations. Creole parts, lots of modifications. There is no stock of spare parts. You have to look for them with a friend, a bit over here and a bit over there, and that's how you get by. So the United States created an economic embargo against Cuba in October of 1960 under what I assume was the Kennedy administration. And very few American goods have been allowed to enter into Cuba since 1960, October of 1960, just 10 months after the revolution. No, excuse me, a year and 10 months after the revolution. So what do? They've got thousands, tens of thousands, estimated about 30,000 of these American cars from 1959 and prior. Well, they'll figure out ways to import things, but mainly they make and improvise. Most of the cars that are used in Cuba today, even though they might look like this, probably don't have their original engine in them. They probably have diesel engines, and they've adapted diesel engines to work and fit these chassis. It's not an easy thing to do, but they're extremely talented at it, beyond extreme. They've had 64 years to figure this out, and they're really amazing craftsmen and women. This is just my library card in Cuba. I enjoyed going to the Jose Marti National Library. Everything was on card catalog cards. And some of them were actually, whoops. Okay, let me just fix something here. I think I have a slide of it. No, I may not, but some of the card catalog cards were actually in Russian. I've never been to a library and gone and seen Russian in Latin America. That should disappear in a moment. And there were actually cards in Cyrillic that I couldn't read. I thought, that's fascinating. Russian books and Russian documents. Obviously, Cuba's was for many years dominated by Russia and the Soviet Union, and they're very present in the library. This is what things looked like in the 50s before the Cuban Revolution. This vehicle I saw in a little town, and I thought, oh, that's a parts car. So that's a car that they just must pirate and cannibalize for parts. And then I walked through the rest of the town and I saw it down the street. It was a bus. That's a bus. It's used and appreciated and cared for, and it is what it is. You see a lot of weird and unusual things in Cuba. Obviously, there are people pounding on anvils to bend metal, and then you see a plasma cutter. It's like, where did this guy get a plasma cutter? Well, he had one. There's all these kinds of shocking things, you know, people pounding on an anvil, and then you go into another shop and the guy's got a plasma cutter. So you see a lot of this working with metal. They were experts and are experts in metallurgy. In fact, they're exporting fenders in some cases in a very artisanal way back to the United States. People now go to Cuba because they're so good at creating parts. So you see a lot of this. This is a Nissan engine in some American body. And I just want to give you a little feast of color. Cuba is very colorful. It's a fun, colorful, passionate, interesting place to be. Needless to say, it's generally either warm or hot. And you just see the most fascinating things. Music is very central to the Cuban spirit. I like this particular dashboard a lot because you'll see a defroster that came from Detroit. Obviously, these cars are built in Detroit, shipped to Miami, put on a boat, and sent to Cuba. This was the 30s, 40s, 50s, from the 20s on until 1959. Well, I don't think a defroster is very useful in Cuba, but there it is. They didn't build cars for Cuba. And I've been told that the cars that were officially exported to Cuba, they changed the miles to kilometers because Cubans and most of the world works in kilometers. The cars that were brought to Cuba undercover in a more subversive and kind of, there was a lot of unofficial trading. Those cars came with miles. So you could tell the difference whether it marked miles or marked kilometers. There are bus stops, quote unquote, car stops, where you go and you know where the car's going. They're going to different parts of town or different cities outside of Havana in this case. They modify the cars and trucks to carry a lot of people. This is the main transport for a lot of Cubans. And I just had a great time as somebody who spoke Spanish well, kind of getting on. Most tourists don't get on these cars and trucks because they're not made for tourists. They're made for local transport. But I kind of bent the rules, and I was there enough so that I could kind of find my way onto these different trucks and cars, and I had a great time doing it. Pepto-Bismol pink is one of the favorite colors of Cuban taxis. The tourists really like pink cars. Makes a great picture. Most of them are convertibles. You can divide these cars into a few categories, but one of them is tourist cars versus personal cars or taxis. Those are the three categories, actually. The car is either used by a family and owned by a family, used for transportation as a taxi, or used in transportation for tourists. And the tourist cars tend to be convertibles, perfectly painted. They may have the original engines. None of the taxis have the original engines because it's too expensive to buy gas. They buy diesel. And individual personal cars could be anything. The car is the most valuable possession in a family in Cuba. It's one of the few things that you could always buy and sell during the Cuban Revolution since 1959. So you see people all the time coming to the airport with wheels. I went into the countryside in a tobacco region and met some really fun guys. This guy was my horse guide. Nabucco was his name. I asked him what he thought about old American cars in Cuba. Like I ask everybody, I have my recorder out. What do you think about this phenomenon of old American cars? He said, I just like horses. He could care less about the old cars. They were just a way for him to get around. And that was typical. This guy lived around the corner from where I was staying. I asked if I could talk to him about his work. He said, sure. His wife came out and wanted to kick me out of the house, but we talked for a long, long time. And he's an amazing tradesman. He took a piece of metal that was basically a body part, a chassis part, and spent 2 years gathering the rest of the car and put it together into a Fiat-like automobile that sells in Cuba for about $20,000. It's one of the most expensive countries in the world to buy a car because importing is impossible from the United States and extremely expensive from every other country. It shouldn't be that way. I don't get into the politics of why it is. You see old Thunderbirds like this, and I met this guy broken down, and somebody's always going to come around to help. They're not in a hurry. If a car breaks down, well, they figure out a way to fix it, or 5 other guys show up and they talk about it for a half hour and something happens and eventually they figure it out. So that's what I did to create this book. I'm gonna leave the floor open to questions in a minute. I'm gonna say a couple more things just because I have notes and I think that they're interesting. Amazon doesn't have a section for bilingual books. The book has to be either in English or in another language. So I wasn't very happy about that. I'm a librarian by trade, a bookseller and a librarian. So metadata for books and metadata in artificial intelligence is kind of how things run behind the scenes in our computers, obviously. I think most of you know that metadata is data about data. Title, subject, author's name, author's country of birth, author's date of birth. All those little bits and pieces of information are what create Amazon and create books. It shocks me that Amazon can only imagine one language for each book. It also shocks me that they don't have a section that allows a seller, my friend who sells this book, who's mostly a used book seller, to identify some books as new and some books as used. So most of these books on Amazon are come in as look like used books when they're not, they're new books. You know, I think that's most of what I came here to say. I wanted to present my book. I have a lot more I can say, but I think it's mostly important that this is not just a monologue, but a conversation. And I'd like to look through my notes really quickly to see if there's anything absolutely important that I omitted, and open the floor to questions. I'll finish with this. I learned a lot of things in creating this book and researching this book, and I'm really proud of some of the lessons that I learned. Here are a few of them. In my opinion, as Americans, we tend to ask permission to do things. It's just the way we are. We're law-abiding individuals, and we tend to want to ask permission before we do something. Can I go in here? Is this door open or closed? Well, I never asked permission to write a book, and I didn't ask permission along the way. I just did it, and I'm glad I did it. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't break any laws. I went to Cuba legally, which was not an easy thing to do. I had to ask permission from the US Treasury Department and get a special license to go to Cuba. Then after the book was underway, I was able to go legally as a journalist. I don't recommend breaking laws, and I certainly wouldn't do anything to hurt anybody intentionally or, you know, destroy the planet. But writing a book was fun, and I think it's what I was put here to do in part, so I did it. And I recommend you guys doing your thing, whatever that may be. Cuba is full of very intelligent and cultured people. And I learned very quickly that one's economic status does not really reflect their intellectual or cultural abilities or their level of understanding and learning and sophistication. I'll tell you a story. It was one of the first things that happened to me when I started meeting Cubans. I was at the Guadalajara Book Fair as an American bookseller, and some of my Cuban friends said, I want to introduce you to the boss. I want to introduce you to the main guy. And I was thrilled. Couldn't wait to meet the main guy. And we're in a booth, and there were 3 or 4 or 5 people hovering around. And they said, this is Eduardo. And it wasn't really clear who they were referring to. There were a few people around, and one of them was a unassuming Black Chinese guy, half Black, half Chinese, more or less. I figured that couldn't be him. That couldn't be the main guy. This is a guy who's maybe selling books or doing something. Well, that was the main guy. That was me being prejudiced. That was me thinking the Black Chinese guy isn't the main guy. Well, luckily, I learned from that. You know, that's not good. And it's very typical. It's very common for us to make those prejudgments. And I do my best not to continue to do that. It hurts me still to think that I would have done. But I learned from it, I hope. Love your enemies, I wrote down. Why not? I mean, Cubans aren't our enemies. I don't think that in any way. I don't even know if anybody thinks that or would say it. But Cubans were dealt the hand that they've got. And they're very gracious and very, very loving and very good people. They don't have anything, and they're the least complaining bunch of people and some of the most fun-loving people I've ever met. We in the United States like to complain about a little bit of everything, I've noticed, myself included. I go to Cuba where they have nothing and sometimes are looking for their next plate of rice for dinner, and I don't hear complaining, and it blows me away. So I just wanted to share that with you. I think it's a reflection that merits consideration. The other thing I learned in Cuba, and this will be my last comment until we take questions. Some of the mechanics said to me, make sure you measure 3 times before you make that cut. I love that. You don't measure and cut. You measure and you measure and you make sure, because you don't want to miscut that piece of metal because there's not another one. And sometimes that's true in other areas. Maybe in social media, maybe you don't want to click that email or that button quite as quickly. Maybe you want to read it a couple of times before you send it out. And I'm sure that's true in other aspects of life. But I learned that from those folks, and I'm glad I did. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My assistants, Sally and Aru, are happy to help me sell some of these books if any of you are interested. They're discounted to $40 for the paperback, $160 for the hardcover. And I'd love to thank those who are joining us online as well. If you want to buy the book, please send a request to my email at miguelsan2006@yahoo.com. I have to charge $5 for shipping to those I'm shipping the book to, but the price remains the same. And I'd like to thank you again. Thank Kelsey and America's LeMay Car Museum for hosting me, and open the floor to questions, if I may. Does anyone want to comment? Does anyone have any questions for me about Cuba, about cars?
Car shows or anything like that we have here in America where they want to show these old cars off?
That's a fantastic question, and yes, they do. At what was and continues to be the Tropicana Casino Show Club, there's a big parking lot. And once a month, they have a big gathering of a specific car club that brings old cars together. In order to have your car exhibited at that event, it has to have some percentage, high percentage of original parts. Yeah, so they're really only there's so many cars that aren't original that like who's going to want to show that? That's just the taxi that I just took here to get here. So they highlight the original cars. There are many of them, many thousands of beautifully maintained old American cars from every year from 1959 backwards. Lots of them. You don't always see them because they're not usually on the road. They're in somebody's garage, but they'll come and show them at events like that. I've seen a Lincoln Continental that looked to me just like the one that John Kennedy was shot in. I've seen extraordinary cars and heard a lot of great stories about them. Yes, sir?
You had mentioned that people show up at the airport with tires, and I didn't understand why.
Because you can't get tires easily. So if anybody's going to Cuba, and this is true for a lot of Latin American countries, they bring whatever their friends need and whatever they can't have, or maybe their family members, or maybe they themselves were able to vacation somewhere or go somewhere for some reason. It's very hard to leave Cuba and come back. There's not a lot of coming and going from Cuba for reasons that are political and complicated, but it's true. And so when people are coming into Cuba, they're bringing things, a lot of things, as many things as they can possibly get into an aircraft. So in Cuba, you know, you go to a Walgreens here, or a Bartell's Drug, or a Trader Joe's, or a Costco, and none of that stuff is available in Cuba. None of it. Easily. Some of it maybe for US dollars. They have dollar stores, and people with dollars, and there are many of them, are able to buy a lot of stuff and keep a level of material expectation that's pretty high for Latin America. But if you've got a friend coming, you're going to give him a list of stuff you want, and on those lists might be tires, because there aren't many. They're not bringing in, you know, you can't drive to Costco and buy 4 tires for $1,000 or whatever it costs. Yes, or maybe you can get tires, but they're going to cost $5,000 for 4 tires, or $3,000 instead of whatever those costs that guy brought in. They're probably used tires, but they're probably good tires. Yes, sir.
Are there any new vehicles at all?
Yes, there are new vehicles. When you see a 1955 Studebaker driving down the street, nobody even bothers to look. But if you see a 2023 Toyota Land Rover, or a Toyota Highlander, everybody's watching that car drive down the street. Just the opposite of what you'd expect here, you know? So yes, often they may be, obviously they're gonna be people with some kind of money, or people with high government jobs. You see a lot of Soviet cars, and I forgot to mention that. They were bringing in cars from the Soviet Union early on, and not just the Soviet states, the Soviet Union, which was Russia for a long time. First it was the Soviet Union, then it was Russia, or vice versa, however you want to look at it. And then Polish cars, Czech cars, most of them are Ladas, L-A-D-A. Moscovich is a similar kind of a Lada. They're built based on Fiats. They're very much like Fiats of the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They're just boxy, decent sedans, basic transportation. And then you will see an occasional Mercedes, an occasional this or that, because there's no political limitation to bring cars in from any country except the United States. But there are economic concerns and political concerns that make that very difficult or very costly. Not yet in any kind. There might be a handful, but I never saw one on the street. There is a great deal of concern in Cuba about the global warming. There may be electric vehicles that are put together much like these, that are sort of pieced together. Since I was last in Cuba in 2019, and there's a lot of trade between China and Cuba. So my best guess would be that there may be Chinese electric vehicles starting to filter into Cuba, maybe in the last 4 years since I've been there. There's more of that, 5 years now. There's more of that than I'm aware of. It's a great question. And I think that will be the future. These cars are slowly being cannibalized into other ones. So the worst ones are off the road. There are already thousands of them that are no longer on the road, and they're in other cars, piece by piece. So as cars get more deteriorated, they get cannibalized and put into other better cars. So the number of old cars continues to drop, and the quality sort of eventually should get better, but there's a lot of this kind of car still used as taxis. Pardon me.
I actually have a little bit of a question. So I was in Mobile, Alabama a few months ago for work training, and they had a lovely exhibit at the Exploria Museum down there. Highly recommend it. But they had one that was all about Cuba, from flora and fauna there to culture to cars. Like they kind of covered everything there. It was a traveling exhibit done in part with the Smithsonian and a couple of other museums. It was incredible. One thing, there were several things that I learned, but I think probably the most key takeaway that I had is that Cubans are very resilient and will make do with what they have. And they're just a very hardy bunch of folks that live there. But I remember one thing that really kind of stuck out to me that was interesting was, again, because of the embargo and not having all of these materials. One of the things that was mentioned about cars was that for brake fluid, oftentimes they would use shampoo.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you could maybe touch on a couple of those other quirks that maybe things that people will use in their cars in order to keep them running while they're still around.
Yeah. Well, there's a saying in Cuba that I'll try to translate from Spanish into English for a screw. In Cuba, you can, obviously there's a word for a screw, but another word for a screw is an infinite piece of wire. Just a long piece of wire. They use wire a lot where we would use screws, to bind something together. There's a fun, I probably can't just jump right to it, but there's a fun anecdote. If I can find it, I'll read it. And if not, I'll just kind of say it, about climbing a hill. Let me see if I can find it. I'll take a second. And it speaks very well to what you just mentioned.
I just thought it was fascinating because I would not have thought of that, but I guess the viscosity is similar. So I'm like, oh, I wonder what other things people there have figured out could be a good substitute for an item that might be difficult for them to find.
Everything and anything. So not all engines are car engines. There could be other vehicle or non-vehicle engines. Here's a chapter called Any Type of Adaptation. Do you want to see some adaptations one has to do? Look, the voltage regulator is a Cuban adaptation, a 14-volt regulator. The normal voltage for that car is not 14, it's 12. For example, the ignition coil is from an airplane ignition, a Chinese airplane coil. The carburetor is from a Soviet car adapted to fit this one. The engine is the same, an inline six. The battery terminals are an invention. Let's go on. The alternator is Soviet. The engine supports are Creole inventions too. And the brushes, they're bought and adapted too. The steering wheel's a Nissan. The tires are not factory. It comes size 16, but these are 14. Like I said, the American car accepts any kind of adaptation. I'm not a mechanic, I am a mechanic, and this is what I do. My car is 44 years old and it still runs straight. I can assure you that there's a car in here to run for another 44 years. They just managed to keep them going. Some of them are pretty shaky. Some of them might not be safe. Certainly they're different than our version of safety, but everything. The anecdote I was looking for is a guy was going up a hill. He ran out of gas. He had to drain the gas tank to figure out what was wrong. And hi, welcome you guys. And he siphoned off the gas into a bottle and he found that something like a quarter of it was water. And he said, Well, I think it's water, but I'm not about to drink it. You can imagine what he was thinking.
Is there a reason why they just don't have factories and build their own cars?
It's a very complex question and an excellent one. They did try to create factories and build their own cars, but it didn't, that project never got off the ground. This guy was one of the heads of that mission. He's a multifaceted engineer and highly technically sophisticated. And he told me that story about the factory and the effort to build vehicles. Cuba has a lot of needs and a lot of needs, material needs. And the government prioritizes things as best they can under the conditions that they have created and they've both created and had to deal with from outside. So it's, there aren't many places that build cars in the world. In Latin America, cars are assembled in Mexico. They're built in Argentina, assembled mostly, but built, one could say. Brazil. And I can't think of too many other parts of Latin America that make cars. So you can't really put Cuba into that. You can't criticize them for not making cars because nobody else in Latin America is making them either, except the three biggest countries, Cuba, Argentina, and Brazil, that I'm aware of. I should say Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, not Cuba. But that's a super interesting question. And there's so much innovation. There's incredible innovation going on. I know about a little of it, but you go to Cuba and if you're on a tour to try to find innovation, you could find all kinds of cool things, all kinds of very cool things that are not in this book, having to do with cars and having to do with climate change and having to do with, you name the topic. They're very, very sophisticated, scientifically oriented individuals with very limited resources. And they're very smart. I wish I had more information. It's not my area of specialization, but it's a fantastic question. And I just heard bits and pieces about things happening and went on and did my work about old American cars. But it's fascinating. And I bet if you Google it, you'll find a bunch of stuff. And if you go to Cuba, you'll find a whole lot more stuff.
When I went to this exhibit down in Mobile, they had a traveling Cuba exhibit. One of the things they had talked about was the climate change aspect. And one thing that was interesting was kind of a side effect, but scientists there are researching it a little bit more now. But pesticides and all of that stuff that goes into growing crops are not allowed there. So they noticed that the coral reef started coming back in Cuba, and a lot of fishies and other underwater creatures have been coming back in that area. So it's a hot spot for marine biology right now. But that's just one aspect of it that I learned when I was at that exhibit.
They also have a lot of urban gardens. There's urban gardening everywhere. Yeah, I don't think they don't import pesticides or much of any of that, to my knowledge. It's fascinating. We're a country that I would say has too much of everything, and they're a country that has not enough of anything. And I wish things were a little different on both sides of the water. But that's the world we're living in. That's not to say we can't change it, but that is the world as it is today. Yeah.
Any kind of regulation for automotive? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. No, they have inspections. They have the government has to certify that a car is roadworthy. Absolutely. Now more than ever. Used to be a little more lax. Now more than ever, and they still try to bend the rules. But no, you have to, especially if you're a taxi, you certainly have to have some minimal amount of solidity to the car. Yeah, they have rules and regulations, absolutely. Yeah, and they bend them and they try to get around them, sort of like everybody in the world. No, it's the same. Depends on, I'd say, your how one wants to travel. It's reasonably easy to sign up for an educational tour and legally go to Cuba on an educational tour. You're with a group, you're learning about something or many things, and you come with a group and you leave. That's easy. It's not real inexpensive, but it's probably worth it. It's a great way to go to Cuba. Other than that, the United States embargo against travel to Cuba only exempts professional journalists and a few other small categories, but it's still illegal. Obama lowered those regulations. He didn't do away with them, but he lowered them such that in fact, nobody's really ever been prosecuted for traveling to Cuba that I'm aware of. But it is illegal unless you're sanctioned for some reason to go there. And I'll say that the reason I was able to go there is because books and art and music are exempted from the US trade embargo against Cuba. So I was a professional bookseller, so I requested a license from the US Treasury Department to buy books in Cuba, which seems like that's the last thing they're going to let me do, but they actually did. I bought books and I figured a way to bring them home, a little bit like those tires, but the other way around, figuring out ways to get books back into the United States. So I'm a professional book distributor by trade. I'm now retired from that work, and a guy with a couple degrees in literature and Latin American literature and language. So that's my area of interest and expertise.
Last question is.
Not at all. I'd love to. We're in no hurry. It's a fantastic question. There couldn't be more receptive and warmer, more accommodating, more hospitable. And you know, they're people that see the difference in economic status. So there's often a little bit of an ask at some point, but you'd expect that. Yeah, sure. They don't see us as very different from the Europeans who are visiting or the Canadians or they really make a very distinct separation between US government policy and people, the American people. Even Castro did that. Even Fidel Castro said, we're not at war with the American people, or we have a problem with the US government. So, well, thank you. If there aren't any other questions, I'd be thrilled if any of you were interested in having a copy of the book. As I mentioned, we've discounted them and we can figure out payment, cash, Venmo, PayPal, checks. The only thing I don't probably take are Russian rubles. And
Thank you so much, Michael.
thank you. Thank you. It's really wonderful to have you.